Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I am going to be complaining about some book-related things. The things I'm going to be talking about today are, for the most part, just things I find irritating or annoying. They're not really necessarily serious enough that I feel like they warrant a full video to cover any one topic. There are maybe one or two individual things that are exceptions, but that I feel like my response is petty, so that's why I figured I would just throw it in here with the rest of the stuff. Usually when it comes to videos like these, I feel like you're either supposed to issue a disclaimer up front that's hey guys, don't take it too personally if you disagree or whatever, or you're supposed to take the super opposite perspective where you're just fuck that, I'm gonna be unapologetic. And I think both of those approaches are perfectly fine. I think it's fine if you're worried about people taking your opinions too personally. I also think it completely makes sense to be buck up. This is the internet, it's YouTube, most of this stuff is not that serious. However, I live and breathe and die by caveats. A lot of my work involves issuing caveats. I am always a caveat person, and so with a lot of my opinions here today, even though I think that they're kind of petty or rooted in pettiness or are silly or whatever, I don't think most of them are really things you should be taking that seriously. I am also always obsessed with the exceptions or the reasons why I might be wrong. So for that reason, I am probably going to be unapologetically apologetic throughout this video. I don't think you should take any of my opinions personally, but as someone who takes everything way too personally, I totally understand if you do. So that's why there's a huge chance that if you disagree with me, I may be issuing your argument for you in this video because that is what I do. Okay, so for my first petty grievance, let's talk about romance novel covers. There's been a recent trend moving away from sort of your typical cheesy posed, if it's a male-female romance, the woman leaning dramatically against the guy, that kind of romance novel cover. And that applies for a lot of non-straight romances as well. There's a move away from that to the more cutesy illustrated kind of vector art kind of style of romance cover, and I am personally not a fan. I love romance novels for how visceral they feel about your emotions, in particular your emotions about love, but also because it's romance, hate, because sometimes you go from hate to love, or a myriad of other emotions about your angst, your family, all of this stuff. One of the things I love about romance is how immediate those feelings are, and I kind of love the way that the cheesiness of those traditional covers mirror that, that it feels very upfront and in your face. And this more illustrated style, it's not new, it's not specific to romance. It's obviously been used in a large number of genres. I typically really like that art style, but for me, for romance, it doesn't capture what I personally really love about romance novels. Again, that sort of immediate feelings that you get from romance novels. They feel so understated and they feel so cute. And I think cute is a part of the romance genre. There's definitely books where that cuteness feels very appropriate, but I feel it's incongruous with how I think of the genre as a whole. One of the covers from the past year or two that I think has really stuck with me is the cover for A Lesson in Thorns by Sierra Simone, which as a book I have mixed feelings about, and I'm planning to review it, so I'll get to that. But that cover is one of the most striking covers I've ever seen, and partially it's just because that cover is just titties, the cover. It's just right in your face about what it is, and I just love that about it. It's just so upfront about what this book, which features all sorts of different type of boning in it, it's so upfront about it, and that's a thing I love about that cover and why I kind of love those styles of covers in general. And with that said, I do totally get why people are shifting toward these kinds of covers. I mean, I would be a total hypocrite if I didn't note the fact that as much as I love the traditional cheesy cover, I also tend to read my romance novels and ebooks because I am a little bit uncomfortable with walking around with a book that's just titties or nipples or chest or whatever the cover. Because yeah, I feel a little awkward about it. And so especially with the genre romance that has sold really well for a long time, but is now gaining this new place of respectability, or where people are starting to more appreciate the craft of it, or appreciate the writers who have made romance what it is and are taking it to new places. making the covers more appealing to a wider number of people and making it so that it's easier for them to carry the books around and stuff like that, that does make a difference in attracting a wider audience. So I don't fault anyone who has found their way to romance in part because the covers have changed. It's just me and my hipster romance loving self that's like, I miss these old covers. And I will also say there are definitely some people who I think are doing these covers pretty well. Whoever does the covers for Helen Wong's books, I think is really, really good. I really like those covers because I feel like they managed to encompass a lot of the book in that art style without like making it feel super blank. There have been some other covers recently in this style that I've been like less excited about, not just because of, you know, moving away from whatever like cheesiness I like, but also just because I think they just haven't been very good. Like they're kind of blank, they're kind of unappealing. So I think it'll only get better from here. Moving on to my next complaint. This is the thing I noticed recently when I think I was trying to read Jade City. And I think it's probably a good book. I just haven't really kind of gotten fully invested. So let me know if I should keep reading. But there was this moment with this one character who in the text, like it says, she was not conventionally attractive or something like that. And then the text proceeds to actually describe her. And I'm like envisioning what she looks like in my head based on how the book is describing her. And I'm like, she sounds pretty attractive. And that is my grievance, because this is not a thing specific to this one book. This is something I've noticed in many books, is that thing where a book will describe a character as not conventionally attractive and then actually describe them, like use specific words to describe them, and you're just like, this person sounds hot. This person sounds like they're going to be played in a CW show by like a CW actor who is very, very attractive. Because I think we've lost all sense of perspective on what attractive actually means. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe we've just like narrowed down what we think is attractive, or narrowed down what we think people have collectively defined as attractive, or narrowed down what we think other people have defined as attractive. I think I might be taking that too far. The point is that I think we've like gotten weirdly, oddly specific. And it weirds me out, especially when I see this in genres like sci-fi and fantasy, because it's weird to me that you would create fictional worlds where the definition of beauty is apparently so similar to our own, when like the definition of beauty in like our own humanity has changed over time, and like even in the same time changes from location to location. Maybe there's like a baseline of like people that collectively we all agree is attractive, but for the most part there are variations, I think, in terms of what we define as like your standard beautiful person. So sometimes when people use that kind of phrasing of like they're not conventionally attractive or they're not attractive, like I'm always kind of like, I don't like, what does that mean? Because there's so many different ways to be attractive. And then you see it in like in YA and romance, and I feel like it's a way of almost kind of like hipsterifying someone's like romantic interest in someone. It's like a worse version of the One Direction song where it's like, you don't know you're beautiful, other people don't know you're beautiful, but I know you're beautiful, and so that makes me beautiful as a human being. And so it weirds me out, like in the context of like how we assign value to someone being beautiful, or like value to them not being beautiful. Like somehow it's more interesting to love someone who's not conventionally attractive. It's also weird to me in romantic subplots, because the thing that I have found, and like this is super cheesy, so I'm sorry, but like when you come to care about someone a lot, especially like in a romantic context, you kind of lose all perspective, at least in this has been my experience, on like whether or not they're conventionally attractive. Like I don't know if it's an emotional thing, hormonal thing. Emotions and hormones are tied, so maybe it's both. It's probably both, but like you get the same feeling of just like beauty is like when you see someone who's attractive. This is why I get weirded out when I read this description in romantic subplots, because I'm like, of course you find this person attractive. Like you are emotionally, hormonally, whatever, invested in them. And so that is what your body is going to do. It's going to find that person attractive. That's fine. You don't need to justify it by like comparing them to the average description that you've decided that the whole world holds up as beautiful. Okay, next complaint, let's talk about reviews. This is one where I like fully accept that like, maybe I'm wrong. Let's talk about it and we'll see. You can argue with me. So my strongly held but potentially petty belief is that a review is not useful if it does not briefly include a summary of the book or movie or TV show that you're talking about. I think that plot summaries are essential for a review. I think they provide vital context, both for what the reviewer is ultimately going to say about the book in terms of their feelings about it, and for whether or not I am going to actually be interested in the book downstream. This is a thing I've felt for a while, but I was thinking about this recently because I saw a critic whose work I very much enjoy, Glenn Weldon. He's part of the Pop Culture Happy Hour podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And he tweeted that basically he does not think summaries are necessary. I don't know if he means that as kind of like a carte blanche thing, and I'll get into why I'm a little bit unsure about that. But basically his argument is that readers of a review, they think they want the summary, but what they really want is context. And I agree with him. It's just that to me, I think of the plot summary as part of the context. I think he's making his argument more about like people who write like paragraphs and paragraphs of plot summary that like it kind of takes over the entire review. And if that's like what he's focused on, like I agree. Like I think that your summary should never overwhelm your review. But I did want to mention his thread just kind of against this like general grievance that I have, because there are reviews that I've read and they come up in certain types of establishments that don't really give you much description of a book, and I often find those reviews incredibly frustrating. If you're someone like me who mostly just wants to know what's happening, the part of the useful context in a review is knowing what the central conflict is, whereas there might be other readers for whom like what they really want to know is like the grand themes of a book, like that's really what will grab their interest, is knowing loosely what is it that the author is talking about, more so than what is the story they're describing. So I don't think that what I'm saying is necessarily at odds with what Glenn Weldon is saying, but it is at odds with how some people structure their reviews, and so that's where my own personal grievance comes from. I don't think I've ever been sold on a book based on the themes. I've been sold based on being told what the story is, and then secondary to that, being told how the themes relate to that, or like what to expect as a reader, and in particular what to kind of be excited for or not excited for as a reader. Oh, here's a quick one that probably shouldn't be quick because I have a lot of feelings about this. The thing I've noticed a lot is that oftentimes fictional scientists really love science, and that might seem like obvious to you, like that might sound like, no duh, Deboki, of course they love science, they're scientists, they're nerds, and you're right, but there is a weirdness where like none of these people ever whine about science, and that's confusing to me because there's a lot of whining in science, there's a lot of crying in science, there's a lot of shouting in science, there is a lot of stuff to process when it comes to science. It is not an emotionless endeavor. It actually takes like a lot of feelings to deal with science, I think. And so yeah, that is just a thing that I've been thinking about lately. Scientists like don't whine enough in fiction. Let's talk about authors whose Twitter accounts basically become endless retweets of other people talking about their books. This is one that I actually do feel bad about because writing is hard enough, marketing is even harder, and I don't know how to do it, and maybe this is a thing that's actually effective. This is something I do tend to notice more for nonfiction authors than for fiction authors, and I think some of that's just like an unfortunate consequence of what I've followed these people for. Usually fiction authors, if I have signed up to follow them on Twitter, I have fully accepted that that Twitter feed is going to be centered around their books. So I expect a lot more discussion around their books because that is central to kind of what they're doing on Twitter. With nonfiction authors, it's a little bit different. A lot of them tend to be like journalists or academics or maybe some kind of other intellectual job type thing first, and then book writers second. And so that kind of affects what I'm actually usually following them on Twitter for. Usually I am interested first and foremost on their like views on the world or a particular subject, and the book is very secondary to all of that. And then they have a book come out, and that is amazing. That's like super impressive. They did all of this research, they got a publisher, they published it. Like that's incredible. Like I fully respect that. But a thing I've noticed many nonfiction authors doing in this case is then they get people tweeting at them about their books and they just keep retweeting those tweets. And then my Twitter feed basically becomes full of them retweeting other people talking about their book. And I'm not interested in that. It just starts to get kind of spammy, and I'll be honest, this is like a thing that I have unfollowed people over, which I sometimes feel bad about because these are people who I otherwise find super interesting. It's just not useful to me, and it doesn't sell me on your book, right? Like me following you on Twitter, like what makes your book more interesting to me is you maybe like sharing ideas that went into it, like background research, process, that kind of stuff. other people being excited about it doesn't really help. Like I said, I actually don't know if this is effective. Like maybe it is effective marketing. So I am really curious like what guidelines writers are given to kind of promote their book and kind of how it's like suggested to them. Like maybe this is a thing they're told to do and maybe it works. I don't know. It's just something that for me is off-putting. So we are on to our last grievance. This one, the grievance isn't petty, but I think I have decided to embrace a petty response to it. And this is about white writers who talk out loud, like they use their words and they put this out loud into the universe, that they are afraid to write characters who are not white because they are afraid to get things wrong. This grievance and some of what I'm about to say is actually based on a discussion that we had on the romance panel at BookNet Fest, where someone asked a question about like these writers and who say this stuff. Again, they put it out loud and they put it out there into the universe that this is a real fear for them. And I think at the time as a panel, we had this feeling of like, you know what? Fine, you're worried, but there are so many writers of color who we can support instead. And so that's like what a lot of our focus is on as readers. And I will stand by that. I feel like it's hard for me to worry about your feelings as a white writer when like there are writers like Alyssa Cole, Beverly Jenkins, and Alicia Rye in romance, and plenty of writers in other genres who are writing full-on like series and amazing books and building out all these worlds with characters who come from a variety of backgrounds. But during the panel, I did bring up this one romance novel that I had read. I don't know if it's romance, maybe more erotica, kind of like in that gray area. It's part of a series. I've actually talked about it in a previous episode of Recent Romance Reading Rundown, so I'll link down to that video down below. But anyways, there was this book and it featured an Indian character, an Indian heroine, which like I was pretty excited about. That's like not a thing that growing up I saw a lot of in like books, and especially in romance. I've seen it only more kind of like now recently. So I was excited, except then I read the book and I was very unexcited. There was just a lot of things in her description, from like the clothes she wore to like the way she was described by other characters, that I just found very irritating and ignorant. But I have more thoughts about it now that I didn't get into in the panel, and I've just sort of been thinking about it more recently, because in that series, which like each book in that series deals pretty heavily with like a kink, so they are pretty intense and like sometimes kind of borderline dark in a way. This one stands out even compared to the other books in this series because this book deals with rape fantasy. And I think like in the context of the book, like it took great care with that plot and like in with her character in the context of that plot. But there's like this underlying squickiness to me, like that one of the first Indian heroines I read in a romance or erotica context was the subject of a plot line that deals with her fantasizing and like actually experiencing being forced to have sex. Most discussions about representation are often actually not about the one representation that might be faulty. Like this one book on its own, it's not really an issue depending on how you feel that one plot line is handled, but against the broader backdrop of like, cool, so you decided to finally write an Indian character like in this genre that does not have many Indian characters, but you're gonna put her in this plot? Like this is what you're gonna put her in? Where like she is repeatedly dealing with like a rape fantasy that's being conducted by a white guy. Like, do you know what context you're working in? Like, that was a thing that, like, for some reason I didn't think about at the time, but, like, after this panel, after talking about this book and talking on this panel, I started thinking about more, and I was just like, wow, fuck, like, that is fucked. I imagine that the writers of that book had very good intentions. I also imagine that the writers who are saying out loud that they're scared of writing characters of color because they're scared of getting it wrong, I imagine that they also have good intentions. Here's the thing, as plenty of people have said, especially people of color, like if you're so afraid of getting it wrong that you're like willing to say that out loud like this, like that you aren't thinking about what it means to say that out loud, like it might be better off that you don't do it. Like that, like it's probably a good sign that you're gonna get something wrong. Those of us who have gotten used to consuming media from a culture that like does not quite know how to portray us, like we've gotten pretty attuned to what it looks like when you're uncomfortable. Ira Madison III wrote an article that I'll link down below in response to the whiteness of Sofia Coppola's movies. And in his case, he was talking about The Beguiled, which erased a slave narrative from a movie set in the Civil War South. And his basic point is like boils down to like, why would you want someone like her who seems so unable to handle this kind of story to actually go there. He says, quote, "There's a lot to be said about a white woman who stays in her lane," which sounds like a free pass, but actually against the broader context of his argument isn't. He says later, quote, "More often than not, an artist's work will do all of the damning for them without them ever having to open their mouths." And that brings me to my own petty feelings about white writers who talk about their fear of writing about characters of color out loud. Embrace your mediocrity. You're allowed to be a bad writer. You can write a world populated purely by white people. You can write a romance series where apparently the only people capable of finding love are white people. And there's a not insignificant chance that you're going to be successful. Just accept the fact that your success is always going to come with an asterisk, that people are always going to talk about your work and your ability as something that needs a caveat. J.K. Rowling built up this whole world of magic and this series that people like me have tracked their childhoods through, but who have also ended up using that series to underpin their frustrations about representation. Whether it's how dirty Cho Chang was done in service of a romantic endgame that had no chemistry on the page or on the screen, or the surprise reveal like a decade or whatever so later that the evil snake was actually always a ambiguously Asian woman, maybe Indonesian, it's not clear, we're not sure, but who also has a Sanskrit name, which like maybe it tracks because like Hinduism, I guess, did make its way to Indonesia. I don't trust J.K. Rowling to have put the thought into that, so I don't know if that's a real thing or not because that's how she treats her characters of color. If J.K. Rowling decided, and maybe she has, I have no clue because I've only decided to like recognize her existence from when the actual series came out. But if she said something today about like how hard it is for her to write characters of color or like non-white characters because she gets so much flack for it, I would be like, boo fucking who. You've got a bajillion dollars in an internet connection. At this point, just like let your world be white because that is clearly what you're more comfortable writing. And we'll just go on talking about your books with a disclaimer that they're pretty fucking white. We've done it already. It's fine. I mean, it's not fine. Like, it's not okay, but it'll be fine for you because we all know that the alternative is a bunch of like this weird racist depiction stuff that somehow manages to be even worse than envisioning a world where like we don't exist. Maybe another one of my grievances should have just been J.K. Rowling. But to bring it back to those white writers who do take the time to talk out loud about how hard it is for them to write characters of color, the reason why it is so fucking infuriating is because your complaint centers you in this discussion about representation. If I am being very, very generous, what I will acknowledge is that you, in this complaint, you seem to at least understand the stakes. You understand that you will not inherently get something right just because you are white, and that's great. At the very least, they have accepted a world in which they are not inherently correct as writers, that they are not inherently correct in their depictions of people of color, that there is something that they can do wrong. And sad as that is progress. Like, that acknowledgement that they do not inherently have the ability to like portray us, like that they have to put work into it, like that is sadly progress for whiteness. But the problem with issuing the statement out loud in these conversations about representation is just so manifold. It centers you, the white author. It makes all of us feel like we're some weird mystical thing that you just like cannot empathize with, that you cannot envision in your world. And it implies that you are somehow the person in all of this who deserves sympathy. And you're not. You're just failing at the basics of like research and empathy, two qualities that I think are pretty key for being a good writer. So in this case, you're just a bad writer, and that's something you're allowed to be. I'm so sweaty now. I'm sorry. I got mad. If you agree, disagree with anything I said, with my caveats, if you want to introduce more caveats, please do so down below. Thank you guys for watching, and bye.